Hey, U.S. History students. Today we're talking about the Native Americans, about Americans moving west and pushing Native Americans off their land, and kind of what happened to the Native Americans and the land that they lived on. Okay, so you may be asking, why did the Native Americans get pushed off their land, and how did the U.S. government do that? Well, just starting from the beginning, from about 1830 to 1890, during this time period, into the time period of the Gilded Age that we're talking about now, the U.S. government did systematically push the Native Americans from their lands and onto what we call reservations. And so the Native Americans lost control of the West during this time period, and there's three major reasons that we talk about as to why. And so the first is a flood of settlers. Americans are moving in large numbers to the West. This is partly due to the Transcontinental Railroad and the railroad system in the West, partly due to the Homestead Act and people moving west for more land, due to gold rush and people wanting to find gold and make it rich, and a lot of other reasons. People are moving west, and so the Native American land is very desirable, and that's being taken from them by American settlers. Two is warfare. They lose control through warfare. The Native Americans couldn't really resist the American military. Okay, so in what we call the Indian Wars, you have settlers and troops that are fighting against Native Americans, and this fighting is taking place, and for the most part, the American military wins out. There are a few instances when the Native Americans did win some battles, but ultimately they're being pushed from their land through warfare with the American military. And three, the destruction of the natural environment. You have Americans moving west. You've got the sharpshooters on the trains killing off the buffalo. You've got farmers putting up barbed wire. You've got cattle ranchers overgrazing their cattle. And the natural environment is just being destroyed by the Americans moving west, and therefore the Native Americans are having a tough time living on that land that was once theirs. After each tribe was subdued by the U.S. government and the U.S. military, they were placed on reservations. Now, these reservations were not nice places. They were usually smaller than the lands that the Native American tribes were used to and had previously lived on, and most of the time they were undesirable. They were given to the Native Americans because the U.S. government didn't have any use for them, didn't want it. A lot of times the U.S. government would promise food and blankets. Sometimes they would make good on this promise of giving food and blankets, but sometimes they wouldn't. They'd also promise to give seeds to the different tribes on reservations so that they could farm. But it wasn't very helpful to a lot of Native Americans because not all Native Americans were farmers. A lot of them were hunters, gatherers, and so they weren't used to farming, and so giving someone some seed and some farm equipment that doesn't know how to farm doesn't really do them a whole lot of good. Here are the Indian reservations. You can see the gray areas are going to be the Native American reservations that were created in the U.S. And you can see it's a bunch of areas that are much smaller than the land that the Native Americans were previously used to living on, and all concentrated in areas that weren't really desirable, out in the desert or up in the Badlands of the Dakotas. And this is where the U.S. government put the Native Americans. We're going to look at two policies that the U.S. government put in place towards Native Americans. The first one is the Dawes Act, and this was in 1887. And this focused on Americanization, or assimilation is a term that you may know. It's where the U.S. government wanted the Native Americans to completely give up their former culture and to completely adopt American culture, to become civilized, if you will. That would mean living on one piece of land and not being nomadic. It would mean farming and speaking English and going to school and doing the things that the American government said would make them civilized. And they followed that policy for a while. And then in 1924, there's a new policy that comes forth, and it's called the American Indian Citizenship Act. This is more of a reversal, a change in policies. This is going to give Native Americans citizenship, U.S. citizenship, and allow them to keep their traditions, their values, their customs. Now here we have a representation of the Dawes Act in the picture. You can see how the U.S. government took this Native American and turned him into this version, which is basically what the U.S. government would call a civilized version. So he's wearing American clothes, American haircut, doesn't have the jewelry, etc. Here, this is going to represent the American Indian Citizenship Act. This is President Coolidge, and he is wearing a traditional headgear of a Native American tribe, and so it's kind of a accepting of their culture, allowing them to keep their culture, and granting them citizenship and the rights of being an American citizen. And I'm going to go into the Dawes Act and the American Indian Citizenship Act a little deeper here in a second. All right, the Dawes Act from 1887. The goal of the Dawes Act, like I just said previously, was to assimilate and Americanize Native Americans, to change them to look more like Americans, to adopt American customs, American values, to speak English, to go to school, to act like other white Americans, basically. And so the Dawes Act was put in place by Congress to speed up that process of Americanization. So the Dawes Act did three main things that you need to know. The first one is it abolished Native American tribes. There are no longer Native American tribes according to the Dawes Act. There are only independent families. So the tribes were split up, and the Native Americans were supposed to live in their normal family units, just like Americans on the East Coast did, and white Americans did, and with a mom, father, and children living together. And they gave each family 160 acres for them to farm. And we just said a second ago, the problem with giving or assuming that all Native Americans farm is an issue because they all didn't farm. They all didn't know how to farm. And then ultimately, those Native Americans who became Americanized, I'm going to put it in quotes, and followed the Dawes Act and did what they were supposed to and got educated and spoke English, they were given citizenship and they were given the right to vote. So this was kind of like their prize. If you do this, we will make you citizens. And that was basically what the Dawes Act was all about. It was about Americanization, assimilation. So what are some problems with the Dawes Act, some issues with the Dawes Act? Well, the first one is it destroyed Native culture because you take away their culture that they've had so long, their tribal culture, and you put them into family units. Also, Plains Indians, for example, were not good farmers. They didn't farm normally. They normally were nomadic. They followed the herds of buffalo, etc. And so telling them that they are all of a sudden are going to start farming, that's going to fail. And then ultimately, even if they did know how to farm, most Native American groups and families were not given good land to farm on. They were put on reservations in the desert, and they were not given good equipment. So how are they supposed to farm? And then third, the reservations they were put on, or fourth, I guess, the reservations that they were put on were disease-ridden, the land was bad, and they were supposed to be educated, but they did not get the same education as white Americans. And so they were kind of left to get this second-class education and expected to be like normal Americans. And lastly, let's talk about the American Indian Citizenship Act. This is 1924. This is a little reversal of thinking by the U.S. government. So before we had the Dawes Act, which was all about Americanization, about assimilation. Now we have the American Indian Citizenship Act. Now, one thing you need to know is that before 1924, most Native Americans were not U.S. citizens. They did not have the right to vote. They were not seen as U.S. citizens, even though all other races were living in the United States by this time. Now, what the American Indian Citizenship Act did is in 1924, it gave all Native Americans U.S. citizenship, which gave them the rights and the entitlements of being a U.S. citizen. And in return, they did not have to give up their tribal lands. They could keep their culture, keep their customs, keep their values, keep their traditions, and they could also be American citizens and get the benefits of that. Although most American Indians were still on reservations during this time period, and a lot still are today. But the American Indian Citizenship Act is not the assimilation trying to change Native Americans. It's more of an accepting and allowing them to also have the benefits of being an American citizen. That's 1924.